Hey folks, so for some reason you need an Nvidia card, but you don't have much more than £130 or so to spend. So for new cards, the only thing that ticks that box is pretty much the much loved or hated GTX 1050 Ti, and you think that's about as good as it's going to get. You don't want to go for an older card for a similar price, so you're pretty much stuck, right? Well, perhaps not, especially if you're willing to dive into the used market, where things get a little bit more interesting. But before that, remember to use those thumbs and let me know what you think of the video, and consider clicking subscribe and hitting that bell notification icon if you've not done so already. So for the same price as a new or even some used GTX 1050 Ti's, you can snag yourself one of these, the ugly sister of the much loved GTX 1060 6GB, the GTX 1060 3GB. Now, contrary to what AMD did with its RX 480 and its 4 and 8GB models, which both feature the same GPU, the 1060 3GB actually uses a cut down version of the GPU seen in the 6GB version. No longer featuring the full 10SM layout of the GP106 GPU, seen in the 1060 6GB, which offers up 1280 cores, the 3GB knocks off 10% of that, dropping it down to 9, which results in 1152 cores instead, as well as a drop to the TMUs from 80 to 72. A great way to make use of otherwise slightly defective silicon. The card's 3GB memory buffer still sits on the 192-bit bus and comes in at an effective speed of 8GHz in stock form, but it can be pushed to around 9.2GHz effective with an overclock, which sees the memory bandwidth jump up from around 192GB per second to 220. At stock, the clock speeds in this Gigabyte card tended to settle in around the 1900MHz mark thanks to GPU boost, and when overclocked we could get it to pass the 2GHz mark. Now my old faithful 1050 Ti test card from Gigabyte again features 768 shading units, 48 TMUs and 32 ROPs, with a 4GB GDDR5 frame buffer connected using a 128-bit memory interface. Out of the box, the memory speed is running at approximately 7GHz effective, and with an overclock we can push that to just shy of 8GHz, which increases memory bandwidth from the stock 112GB per second to a much more respectable 128GB per second. At stock, the GTX 1050 Ti, it kind of settles in around the 1.6GHz boost, and with a slight overclock we can kind of push that to around the 1700MHz mark. But is it really worth buying the cut down GP106 based 1060 over the full fat GP107 seen in the 1050 Ti? I mean, one's got Ti in the names and the other is a cut down version of a card. Well, let's see how these two cards fare at the end of 2018 by putting them into the 6-core 12-thread Xeon test station, which is running the latest version of Windows and the latest Nvidia drivers, as well as 32GB of RAM, and see just how much more, if any, bang for your buck you get by sidestepping the slot in favourite 1050 Ti for something with a, on paper at least, better specification. First up, we've got Rise of the Tomb Raider, running at 1920 by 1080 on the high preset, and performance, it varies considerably between the two cards, with the GTX 1060 3GB returning over 90fps on average compared to just under 60fps on the 1050 Ti. Overclocking the 1050 Ti does see its averages kinda reach 60fps, but at the same time the GTX 1060 3GB can be pushed even further with an average almost into the 100s. Now into Rise's more graphically intensive sequel, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again at 1920 by 1080 on the high preset. Now the GTX 1060 3GB in stock form, it struggles to hit 60fps on average, while the GTX 1050 Ti, it only manages in the high 30s. A considerable difference. Overclocking the 1060 helps see it creep past that 60fps barrier, which is nice, but to be honest with you, doing the same on the 1050 Ti is fairly pointless, as the 1% lows even at stock form were still above 30fps, and at 1080p you're going to be wanting to lock this game at 30fps for any chance of a decent, consistent gameplay experience when using the 1050 Ti, unless of course you're willing to dial back some of the settings. In Far Cry 5, on the high preset with TAA enabled, the GTX 1060 runs away with it once again, with an average frame rate of 70 and really impressive 1% lows, resulting in a smooth gameplay experience. The 1050 Ti returns under 50fps on average and under 40fps for its 1% lows. When we overclock the card, the GTX 1060 sees its 1% lows jump up to 60 FPS, making things even smoother, while overclocking the GTX 1050 Ti, there was hardly any difference. As I've mentioned in other videos, Far Cry 5 loves memory bandwidth, and the 1050 Ti, it struggles a bit here. Like Shadow, dropping the settings or resolution on the 1050 Ti would have a positive effect on the frame rate, so 60 FPS might be achievable at the expense of visual fidelity. Now, Forza Horizon 4 here on the medium preset at 1080p has already proven to be a test, which runs really well. Here in stock form, the GTX 1050 Ti returns a great result, with its 1% lows even remaining above 60 FPS, which is critical for a racing game. Overclocking actually helps here a little, and it pushes that 1% low figure to almost 70 FPS, and while that's certainly an acceptable result for a GPU of this size, it doesn't match up to the 1063GB in stock form, which returned an absolutely great result, averages in the 100s with 1% lows in the high 80s, and when we overclock the 1060, we see averages jump over 110 FPS, with the percentile lows careering past 90. Really, with the GTX 1060, you could be doing with upping the detail presets easily here, but it's good to see that the 1050 Ti can achieve good frame rates when settings are tailored to the power available. Now finally onto a game that I'm actually quite enjoying so far, Battlefield 5. With the 1050 Ti, the difference between stock and overclocked, it's fairly negligible, and returns an average frame rate in the mid 40s, while the 1% lows were in the high 30s to low 40s depending on the boost clock. So you will be wanting to lower the graphical settings from what I've shown here if you want to shoot for 60 FPS. The GTX 1063GB in stock form does manage to hit 60 FPS on average however, which is great to see, and its 1% lows were fairly respectable in the low 50s. Overclocking this card, it sees a decent bump in both the average frame rates and the percentile lows, and it does actually offer up a notably smoother gameplay experience. So it's fairly clear then, there is a pronounced difference between the cut down GTX 1063GB and the 1050 Ti. And with both cards coming in at a fairly similar price, if it was a toss up between the two, I'd most definitely go for the 1063GB. Even if we take the 1050 Ti's best results and compare them to the stock GTX 1063GB, you can see that you're getting a considerable amount more performance for roughly the same cost. And with the GTX 1063GB being found in its most basic forms like I've got here on eBay for around about £120 or so, it means that you would need to spend something like £75 on the 1050 Ti to achieve the same performance for the money, and I'm struggling to see any 1050 Ti's that are going for that price at the moment. The age-old argument with the 1050 Ti is that it requires less power, and this kind of also starts to fall apart here when comparing it to the 1063GB. Yes, the lower end SKUs of the 1050 Ti require no external PCIe power connectors for sure, but the more expensive models, the more gamer focused models, they all require a 6-pin power connector, which is exactly the same as the GTX 1063GB, and that should be food for thought for you. And I've said it a lot, and I know I give the 1050 Ti a pretty hard time, but unless you're absolutely certain you need a slot only powered card, then the other options out there make far more sense for your gaming rig. And remember, this is coming from a guy who has actually bought one of these 1050 Ti's for himself. But with that, I'm going to leave it there. As always, thank you for tuning in to watch this video. I'd love to hear what you think of these two Green Team budget cards, and if either of them is something that you would still consider to put in your build today. Remember to use those thumbs and let me know what you think of this video, and consider clicking subscribe if you've not done so already. For now though, I'll just say take care, and I'll see you all in the comment section down below, and in the next video.